970-4130. Yeah, this is for Africa, Congo. 970. Good morning. This is the Dr. Oba T'Shaka, the Dr. Oba T'Shaka show. We've been waiting to try and get a hookup with Dr. Theophilo Benga. We arranged this 3 weeks ago. And so far, the connection, whatever's happened, it hasn't happened. So we have to determine what we're going to do here. We're going to do an interview with Dr. Theophilo Benga on his intellectual contributions and his relationship to Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop. And the theme that was going to be stressed was the theme of the African and African American system of mastery, with an emphasis on the development of Dr. both Sheikh Anta Diop and Theophilo Benga. We're going to do a comparison between the mastery systems that Dr. Obenga was shaped under through apprenticing under Sheikh Anta Diop, and compare that to the mastery system that operates in the United States and in the Western Hemisphere. And this is the subject of the book that I'm finishing now. On Seba, it has two parts. One is on how the mastery system applies in the classroom and community, prisons, liberation movements, spiritual institutions, and then also how this mastery system applies in the apprenticeship system. And so Dr. Obenga, the discussion we're going to have today, was going to be used to illustrate both how the master Sheikh Anta Diop and Dr. Obenga developed, comparing that development to how we've shaped masters in this country. So if Dr. Obenga and his computer technician hook up with us, because we had arranged this 2 weeks ago, and we've been in contact with them as close to as yesterday. If they hook up, then they can come in and then we can take on the discussion. So I had a choice of whether just to shut this show down or to take this up. And so I decided I don't want to shut the show down. So if Dr. Obenga comes in, he's in Congo, Democratic Republic of the Congo right now. Yesterday, they concluded a conference on African unity. And so he's still there. So if he hooks up, he can come in. And if not, then I'm going to give an overview of the discussion that would have underlied or underlay the discussion with Dr. Theophilo Benga. And when we can get him on, we'll have him on for his interview. Dr. Obenga, Sheikh Anta Diop, John Henry Clark, Dr. Jacob Carruthers, Marimba Ani, a host of others, Malcolm X, John Coltrane, in athletics, our great athletes. In all areas of life, we have shaped masters. And we're generally not aware of what this mastery system is. Myself included, when I was undergoing an apprenticeship in it, it was only later that I understood its origins and going deeply into it, its stages and its development. So what I'm going to do is give you a brief survey of this mastery system that's covered in great detail in my book on Seba. And 600 pages has been completed looking at 6 masters. I'm just going to give you an overview of how this system works. And this system shaped Dr. Theophilo Benga, though he was also influenced by French education, something we'll explore when we interview him. That did not put him in the stage of mastery. It was this African mastery system. And this is particularly important today because we have a lot of youth who are facing a lot of trials and tribulations. Some of them are handling them well, and some of them are being put on the bottom of this system and are questioning what is even the purpose for them existing. And this system is one of those things that you need to know because it can help you with your life purpose. But it's good for all of our people. And it's the way in which we take the gifts that we discussed before when we looked at the Ka, the Ba, and the internal gifts that we have. It's the way we take those gifts and then take them to a level of mastery. And this system continues in the United States today, though it's been weakened by the hostile external forces that hit Black communities since 1968. And it's been weakened mainly by peer groups thinking that they don't need elders and that they can rely on each other for growth and development. But still, any of our youth that want to go to a level of mastery, they cannot avoid this system. It's both organic in that it's natural, but it's evolved and it's developed. This isn't good for people who want to play around and who aren't interested in mastery or who think that just going with what you have is enough. In ancient Kemet, they would teach that no matter what level you're at, always be open to the wisdom of others because no one has achieved perfection, and advise that you should go and listen to those who are in the market, meaning everyday people. John Coltrane had a saying that he could learn from the worst musicians because there was something they could do that he couldn't do. So this system is not trial and error. It's a no-joke system. And if you want to be a master, you have to go through it. Muhammad Ali went through this system by mastering the masters of boxing. Chris Rock doesn't know it. He went through this system by mastering the masters of comedy. Any area where you see mastery in Black life, African-American life, or African life globally, people who have achieved mastery have gone through this system and continue to go through it. John Henry Clark is one of the masters that I interviewed for my book on Seba. And he said the only thing he regretted towards the end of his life was that he had no masters to study under, meaning he didn't have anyone older than him or close to his age that he could learn from. And which is telling you that this is a continuous system. It's not like university education where you go for so many years and this is it. This is also a total system. It's a mind, body, spirit system because when you're pursuing mastery, you're pursuing it of your gifts. And when you're pursuing the mastery of your gifts, then you put your whole self in it, mind, body, and spirit. And the only way you can achieve mastery is to find those who have gone further than you. And so this is the nature of the system. I believe This is a replica of the system in heaven, because I think that until you reach the highest level in heaven, because there are levels of heaven, spirits in heaven are still learning. And so there are masters guiding them. And in the level of parapsychology, we know all people have guides, spirit guides. And these spirit guides are masters. And there are some who are great masters. And depending on the level that you pipe into, then you can pipe into high levels of mastery. So when you see a George Washington Carver constantly creating and recreating science, becoming the greatest scientist in the world, as he said, he was thinking God's thoughts. He was piping into God's mind, but he was also piping into great masters who served God. And those masters were helping guide him in his gifts. He was doing things to cultivate his gifts. And then as he rose to higher and higher levels, then he gained greater guidance. And of course, because he was a highly evolved master and spirit, he was able to pipe into the greatest master of all, God. And in the system, the greatest masters are those that have piped into God, God's mind, because they are the ones that usually uncover what's new. And what's new is what hasn't been discovered before. It doesn't mean they created it. It means that they uncovered something previously unknown to humanity. And so it's when you pipe into God's mind that you're able to do that. And there are only a few masters at this level. So this system of mastery is organic because it's natural in terms of its developmental stages. But it's not something that you're just going to find on your own. It's something that you have to pursue under guidance. In the martial arts, it's the same system in that it's a system guided by master martial artists. So you can never get from a book what you'll get from a master. However, in this system, it's an apprenticeship system, and therefore there are two types of apprenticeship. One is direct, where you have a living master or masters that you draw from, and one is indirect, where you draw from masters who have either passed on through their works, or they may be away and you're not directly in their presence, and therefore you draw from them indirectly. And sometimes a person will undergo both direct and indirect apprenticeship with the same master. John Henry Clark began apprenticing under Arthur Schoenberg long before he met him. And Arthur Schoenberg was one of his first two masters. So, and this is a flexible system. And because of its flexibility, it'll work under differing circumstances. And it worked quite well under enslavement. We know very little about how well it worked because it was secret, and we're going to go into that in a minute. But we know it worked well because it continued after slavery. And the systems that we came up with, or that were practiced after slavery, that were apprenticeship systems, could have only been practiced after slavery had they been practiced during slavery. And the only way they could be practiced during slavery was under great secrecy. So there's a lot of things we don't know about our enslaved ancestors because they were doing things that they kept secret. And that is one of the qualities of African people. We're good at secrets. Some of us have now become so open, we tell everything we know. But that's not the way of Africa. And those who are observant of enslaved Africans said, these are a secretive people. And I should say Caribbean Africans are more secretive than African Americans because they're more traditional in their culture. But we are also. And there are some things that are best kept to yourself. So even with this discussion, draw your own conclusions about what I'm saying here. So the discussion we're going to have today with Dr. Obenga, if he's able to come in, then we'll get in with him, was going to be to show the path of mastery that he pursued under Grandmaster Sheikh Anta Diop and the mastery that he pursued under other masters. And we're going to compare those to the African-American system. So what I want to do is give you an overview of this system, which will be in more depth than I would have with Obenga because we have concentrated more on his work. But it will give you an overview into this system. It is one of the crown jewels of African-American culture. The mastery systems of Africa, the mastery systems of the Caribbean and South America, and the mastery systems of Afro-America, and those found in Asia as well among African people in the South Pacific. They have their common origin in the mystery systems. Now, we often think of Kemet as the source because their educational systems were mystery systems, that is, people who went through it could not divulge what they learned. And this was because there was great power invested in what they learned. And you couldn't be sharing this with someone who had not undergone initiation, training, because they might misuse this power. So some people think this was a weakness in the African system because we, of course, are democratic people. And so we think everything we know should be shared. But along with knowledge comes responsibility. And so there are certain kinds of knowledge that you don't want someone to have until they've demonstrated the responsibility to exercise it in a way that will not bring harm to others. So the mystery systems of Kemet that were highly evolved into Perank, P-E-R-A-N-K-H, House of Life, which was the university systems in Kemet, Egypt, the highest in the world. And they were found in the temples. And they were taught by masters, by priests. They taught every area of knowledge except military knowledge, which was conveyed in the palace of the pharaoh through those who mastered the military arts. So Kemet took this mystery system and raised it to a very high level, the highest level we know in the world today. But I'm making it clear the source of this came from Inner Africa, because we find these same systems all over Africa. And these systems in their origin predate Kemet. Kemet represents the highest expression that we know of the mystery systems, but their roots are in Africa. And these we know in the 18th and 19th century as secret societies. And they continue in Africa today in secret societies. And they continue in the Caribbean as well, and among Africans in America. So the mystery systems in Kemet and in Inner Africa had the purpose of transmitting the culture of the people. In Kemet, they had two levels, at Seba, which were your primary education, secondary education, and then Perank. And in Inner Africa, secret societies. The most important in West Africa was the Poro Society, P-O-R-O, Poro, but there were many others. And these are especially important with the coming of slavery and colonialism in Africa. So in Perank and ancient Kemet, you train people in all the areas needed to reproduce the culture. I showed a picture of Perank a few weeks ago that showed the symbol was a sar, in the center. And then he's standing on 9 bows. Those 9 bows represented the enemies of Kemet. Asar being in the center meant that this was a place of life, death, and rebirth. So education was transformational, and it was symbolized by Kepra, the beetle. This ring that I have on, the beetle, Kepra. My name, T'Shaka, means beetle, which means transformation. So in Inner Africa, when young people were taken through education, they were told they would die. They thought it was literally true. And but what it meant was they would die in one state and be reborn in another. So one of the distinguishing features of African education, and particularly of the mastery system, is it's a life, death, rebirth system because it replicates life. Last week, we had a discussion on trauma, and Sister Brianna Moore was talking about how, as she transitioned out of drug addiction into a clean life, she understood she was undergoing a butterfly experience where the caterpillar had to die for the butterfly to be reborn or to be born. And that's literally what education is, real education. Western education is memorization and regurgitation. But African education, while there is a level of memorization, and there's certainly a level of facts, it's transformation. We use these as ideas, but this is actual experience. So people who go through these mastery systems die in one state and are reborn in another, just as Sister Brianna Moore was describing her experience of coming from the level of addiction to the level of being clean, and then transcending to her gifts. She was entering into new skin, literally. She was being reborn. And that is the nature of the mastery system. It's an experience. So what I'm describing is just the outer shell. I'm going through this now. This is a lifelong thing. You continue. And that's good because then you're constantly growing and developing. Because I think the time that you leave this earth is when you no longer see a need to grow. And I see a lot of people who go at a certain age, and I'm not going to name names, and some of them have made great contributions, but they've reached a point where they're repeating themselves. And if you reach that point, you should know, if you're at a certain age, you only got so much time here, because this is a place for growth and development. This is a place to get closer to God. So God will give you some time, but then something will hit you like cancer or something else. These are external signs of it's time for you to go. It doesn't mean if you get cancer, it's time for you to go. It may well mean that you need to correct your diet. You need to handle stress, a bunch of other things. But on the developmental level, if you've made your contribution, you only have so much time left. You need to know that, because there's other spirits in heaven waiting to come here. I mentioned this, well, my sister mentioned this on the show on astrology, where she said, my mother said that once she was finished with her school, which was a preschool, that she was ready to leave, meaning to leave. She didn't believe there was heaven, so she thought she'd go into the earth. She later found out, as she communicated with my sister from the other side, that if she knew heaven was so beautiful, she wouldn't have fought going for a couple of years, because she told me the last few years of her life, she was on borrowed time. She was so strong in her spirit that she got God to extend her time. I hope I'm able to do that. But when we looked at her chart astrologically, we could see, and we already knew my mother, we knew she had done her work. She wanted to have children. She wanted to be in love. She was a love bug. And she wanted to teach. She did all of those and did them well, and grew in love, because that's the main thing to learn in life. So this mastery system is really about us doing the work we were destined to do, that is the choices we made in heaven for coming here, that is our purpose in life. And so those of us who listen to the light within, the gift within, and try and pursue it, then that's the greatest joy in life. It's not whether you are compared to everyone else the best. It's whether you do your best. And in the pursuit of that, then that's where you find your fulfillment. So this mastery system is a system that provides the path to ascend to the highest level. And I should point out, in this system, there are levels and stages. I'll briefly describe them. And everyone doesn't go beyond a certain stage, and that's okay, because they are looking at where they're at and they're satisfied. So if you're satisfied with that, that's fine. And there are masters who make a certain contribution and they want to stay at that level of contribution, and that's okay. And then there are those who are dissatisfied and constantly trying to go higher and higher, and that's okay. And those who really do well with that, they really set the standard for everyone else. So this is the path for perfecting your joy, perfecting your wish, perfecting your gifts or your ka that we've covered in previous shows. And I can say, because we have systems in this country that come out of Africa, because we have not, many of our scholars have not spent the time studying our systems. And even those of us who have, let's say, who are in the arts, for example, and who are into mastery in the arts, in which this is very heavy, in jazz or blues or any of these fields, this mastery system is very strong. Most people in it don't know its origin or its roots. They don't know it's African in its basis. John Henry Clarke, who I interviewed for the last 8 months of his life on the masters in his life, the last interview being in his wife's house in New York after an ASCAC conference, which, by the way, was a time where we decided to bring in Dr. Theophil Obinga to teach at San Francisco State. John didn't know that the system he came up under masters was an African mastery system. And in fact, when I finished the book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, John had written an introduction along with Asa Hilliard. I went to John's house. It was my first time to be in his study, the only time. I had a study of 25,000 books. And I was giving him a signed copy of the book to thank him for taking the time, because he was ill, he had cancer, and he was doing his most important writing, to thank him for being so kind as to write an introduction, to take time to review the book, to give me comments. And then while we were talking, I explained what I'm going to go through now briefly. And then is this mastery system. And then he said, how are you going to explain something as complex as that? And I didn't answer him, but in heaven, I think he knows, by using people like you, because I have 6 masters in the book. Coltrane's one, Ella Baker's another one, John Henry Clarke's one, Obinga is one. And so by using people like you as an examples, people will see how this works. So I'm going to give it to you simple. There's a lot of stuff underneath this, but it's all about experience. So I'm just describing an outer experience that shaped a Theophil Obinga or a Sheikh Anta Diop or a Malcolm X. And I know Malcolm was not conscious of the system he was going up under, but it is natural that if you want to be the best at something, that you want to learn from the best. That's natural. And so if you start that process, you'll find yourself on this roadway. So when I first got into this, after I underwent an awakening in '63, there are 2 awakenings. One was the 6-fold stages to mental freedom, to de-assimilating, getting into an African mindset. The other one was the mastery. I didn't know this was an African system, but I knew the people that I was picking as masters, they matched my gifts. And they were masters of what they did. And I'll go into briefly a few examples of that. And so I kept pursuing that. And then later I discovered this is an African system. But that's because I spent time on the African American one. I would not be able to explain the Dogon system had I not come to understand the African American system, because that's the one you live, and you're translating the African system, that it's the root to the fruit. And so when you're dealing with the fruit, which is the African American system, and you see it's basically the same, then you better understood the root that you came through. You know what I mean? And so that's what really gave me clarity, because I'm going through a system, but I didn't have a perspective for what these stages were and everything else. I was going through them. But later, I could understand that, because then I had something to compare it with, which is African American culture. And one of the things I like about Dr. Obenga, when we get him on, you'll get to hear this, is he never looks at Kemet without looking at Inner Africa, because one is an expression of the other. And it's the same thing with Afro-America. If you're looking at the African, whatever it is, in this case, a mastery system, then you also have to look at its component here, the African American. And because our scholars on Kemet don't study us, they don't really know how rich this culture is. That's partially why they didn't study it. And that's a big mistake. So we need to know the fruit, which is us, to better understand the root, which is Africa. You understand? And guess what? Some of these fruit can end up being more beautiful. That is, when, the seeds fall and new trees come up, sometimes they can be even more beautiful than that which it came from. And in some respects, this is true of what we created, just as Africa has its beauty that exceeds ours in certain areas. So what's this mastery system that comes out of Kemet? And by the way, without it, no Kemet. Without it, no great African civilizations. Without it, our people would not have been able to transcend the hell that they faced in this country, because it was the mastery of not only skills and techniques, but of character, which is the core of the mastery systems of Africa, that enabled our people to, in many cases, transcend, because the African and America and the Caribbean and South America had a sense of nobility. This is what you don't get about enslavement. You get that they broke us. They did. Very few were broken. Very few. People are not horses. And it's hard to break a horse too, because even though a horse will let you ride it, there's a time where if you anger that horse, it's going to throw you. It's still a horse. But a human being, you can't really break a human being. And so this nobility that Africans had, which was greatest in slavery and right after slavery. And anyone that knows our people know that. If you're from the Caribbean, they have the term I've used before, poor great. Poor materially, great spiritually. And we have the same thing. And the closer you are to enslavement, the closer you are to Africa, the more nobility you have. And the art form you create is probably the most majestic art form on the planet, starting with the spiritual blues. And it is an art form of great nobility. They have a film now on respect on Aretha Franklin. You should go see it. She picked Jennifer Hudson to portray her because she saw the quality of her voice and saw her acting chops. But if you look at Aretha, she was crowned Queen of Soul. And she said she liked that. She said, what's better than being a queen? She was of a people who saw themselves that way. You know what I mean? And it wasn't just because they had proof that they came from a family of kings, but it was because, as a brother said once when I was in the sauna at the Y, he said, king or queen or not, he said, we come from good stock. And I would say regal in character. And that's the nobility of our people, what Du Bois called the souls of Black folks. And when you have a culture rooted in spirit, then that culture is going to be noble. And while we have all the fractures and breaks and all the mess, at the heart of it, what saves us is this nobility of character. As Brianna said last week, my mother didn't raise me to be no drug addict. It sounds like she didn't stay in the pit very long, because once you get in there, it's hard to get out. But there was the regality, the nobility of our people that helped lift her up. And at the heart of this is the greatest system of mastery on the planet Earth. The greatest system. And I'll make this as a general assertion. If you see a Black person who's a master, who is the best at what they do, ideally in character as well as technique, but we don't always have the character. I have to be honest about that, because slavery did some damage. So Miles Davis was the best in music on the trumpet, or one of the best, but he didn't always, reveal the highest level of character. And there are reasons for it, But the point is, due to the mess of slavery and the mess of racism and all the rest of this stuff, so some of us, we can be off on character, but very often our masters are also masters of character. John Henry Clark was a wonderful human being. John Coltrane, even in drugs, never lied, never stole, great character. So this mastery system isn't just one of technique. It is the mastery of good character, the mastery of humility, the mastery of integrity. John Henry Clark, one of the things I apprenticed under him for years. And John was just a kind person. He always had time for people. And John was a gentleman. He carried himself with nobility. Always had a suit and tie on. So you might put that down and say, oh, that's white. But it's the dignity of it that you need to get. You know what I mean? So what is this system? So in ancient Kemet, you had the mystery systems, and the mystery systems trained people in every area of life so they could reproduce this great society. And when Asara stands on 9 bows, it means that education is for the purpose to prepare people to protect their civilization and reproduce it. That's basically what education is about. And so generally the Kemites would not admit non-Kemites to their educational system, but a few they did, very few, because it is to protect their people, to reproduce their society. And they weren't training warriors in Paran, but they were training people who would reproduce the civilization, and that's the best defense. And so they trained people in all areas, mathematics, which was real key. The Kemites give birth to geometry. And that comes through the flooding of the Nile and the need to redistribute land when it's lost. And so they came up with geometry as a system of measurement. And so you find when the Greeks try and replicate what the Kemites did to some extent, Socrates or Plato, Pythagoras, who was the one who was faithful to the Kemetic system in a holistic way, they required that you know geometry. So geometry was like key so that you had a sense of order a friend of mine who's a mathematician, Leon Dixon, makes the point that mathematics leads you mentally to make fewer mistakes. And so it's good for discipline. They trained the priesthood, both who were healers as well as builders. And astronomy was linked to architecture because they built according to the location of the stars and they built for eternity. They trained teachers. They trained artists. They trained all of the skills needed to reproduce a society, people who could run business, a host of things. So this was Perant, but there was transformation that people underwent through this mystery system. This same system is found throughout Inner Africa, and it is the source for Kemet's mystery system. And we know quite a bit about these secret societies, that is, those of us who study it. Now, the thing about what hits Africa with the coming of colonialism and then slavery, when the European comes into Africa, they want to supplant the African educational system and put theirs in its place. And I mentioned on a previous show the Mohawk Conference, which was held in the 1890s, which was the US political leadership, economic leadership's two meetings to set up a system of control for Blacks in this country around what they called industrial education. So this was the European American effort to supplant what we had been carrying on in enslavement. They didn't really appreciate it, but they knew there was something else going on there. And they wanted to create a system that would make it possible to have a pliable workforce. That was basically what they were concerned about. And to this day, Western education is basically about training people for work. That's basically what it's for. And most of you that go through higher education do it for a job. I didn't. Some people don't. I had no idea of what I was going to be doing when I got out. I went to learn the truth, to only discover later that I had been lied to. But I enjoyed my miseducation because it was better than the elementary and junior high school and high school. I was at least reading books and thinking about things. And mostly white, a few of them were good, like administration. That's an area that I have an interest in. But by and large, I found it to be a waste. But I didn't know that till I woke up, till I began to see myself through my own eyes. But the key point is that education is designed to reproduce your society. So this is a capitalist society. So the goal of education in the West is to reproduce people who will work in some component of the society. And since they don't have much work for a lot of Blacks who particularly don't have skills now, then it's for preparing you for prison or just the streets or the military to service the system. And once you finish, they'll discard you. So that's generally Western education. And it's, of course, claimed to be one that encourages people to think. But basically, if you go to university, they really want you to feed back what they've told you. It's regurgitation. So the African system was total. And when it comes to the presence of colonialism and slavery coming first, Africans find their traditional education under attack. So they go to the bush. And in the bush, they set up what were these traditional systems that had been on a large scale before universities in West Africa, Sankore, Timbuktu, and others. And so now they're going into the bush and they're secret societies. The largest was the Poro Society that comes out of Sierra Leone. Senku, who is on the slave ship Amstead, overthrows that and is able to find machetes, arms the people on board, and they're able to free themselves. And so there's a film on that you've seen. And if you read the writings on that, he eventually gained his freedom because even though he freed himself on the ship, was eventually captured, put on trial, and was freed. But the key point is he was a member of the Poro Society, a warrior society. And so when little girls would get to go up on deck on the ship, they would come back and say, machete, machete, in their language. Well, machete is a favored weapon of African warriors. And in fact, if you check out the Cuban Revolution under Antonio Maceo, the great general, they basically defeated the Spanish with machetes. And I was in Cuba at the Cuban Museum, the National Museum. I have the picture in my study. And one African took a machete and sliced the Spaniard in half from head all the way down. And it's only when the US intervenes they're able to stop that because they saw another Haiti coming into being. But these Africans who were fighting, and the whites alongside them, but the Africans who make up the majority of Cuba, they come out of warrior societies, secret societies. In fact, the Leopard Society is real strong in Cuba. And these are the fiercest warriors you're going to find. You hear me? Sisters went through secret societies and they underwent trials that were as fierce and challenging as the warrior societies that African men went through. And one of the things they learned was how to handle a man. If a man gets out of order, how to put him in check. And by the way, in African secret societies, now this is a real key thing, men were the first ones to form secret societies, but you know how sisters are. They insisted that they had to have them too, so they formed their own. But here's the deal. In every African male secret society, there's at least one woman, but there is never a man in the women's secret societies. Because sisters know something about keeping secrets that some brothers don't know because they raised you. So there's some stuff they just ain't going to tell you. You understand? They're the source of your wisdom. They're the source of your life. So in inner Africa, then they go into the bush and it's the elders who are carrying out the initiation of the younger people to see that the culture is maintained, because now with the presence of the European, the missionary systems come in later, their Western educational systems are coming in, their language is coming in, their religion is coming in. So the elders are holding on to the tradition. And unlike the mystery system in Kemet, they're teaching everything. They're not teaching just the skills, but they're teaching battle. They're teaching warriorhood. The Poro societies and other societies were so important that throughout West Africa, when it came to electing kings, as particularly colonialism and slavery rears its head in Africa, then the secret societies play a very key role in the selection of kingship. And this is extremely important. And they were like a police force inside of African societies because they were secret. And so even kings, if they were off and doing something wrong, they feared the secret societies because they had the authority to carry out justice against them. So these societies maintained order inside of African societies as they were reproducing the society through the culture. And we know, of course, the first thing in secret societies was the initiation into manhood and womanhood. And so you have rites of passage. We're trying to do that today. We need more of those. And when we had Sister Kujichaga Leah on, one of my former students, she stressed how important that these secret societies be rigorous, not be superficial. And the ones that have worked real well have been those who have been very rigorous. So that was one level of secret societies, but then there were other levels. And these secret societies, it's say among the Bambara, the major initiation occurs at the age of 21. They've already gone through the initiation of manhood earlier that I just described. But this is the initiation into mastery of your gift. And that's at 21, you stay in that for 21 years. And during those 21 years, you cannot leave the village because your responsibility is to defend it against attack. It's said that Malcolm's great-grandfather, great-great-great-grandfather Ajar was Bambara, a warrior cultivator. In his case, a master builder, a skill he passed to all of his male children. Malcolm was the only one not to really pursue that. So the mastery system was a total thing. At the age of 42, the person who is going through the initiation, that person is now free to travel the country and now apprentice under masters that are beyond the level of skill that the masters they've apprenticed under for the 21 years. And they travel throughout Africa. So this was an educational system that, went all over. And it was always like if you were a blacksmith, then, you're taking your anvil and you're going around the country learning from other blacksmiths. And blacksmiths didn't just smelt iron. They were at a very high level in the African system because they were drawing on the spirits of the earth. And so they were very powerful people, played a very important role in initiation and everything else. So this initiation transformation system was a lifelong process. And so what we see is when enslavement occurs and you have Africans being enslaved in the US, we have them enslaved in the Caribbean and South America, wherever they're taken, the age of enslavement is 18 to 35. That's the average age. Now, some were children, a few were old. But if you had them between those ages, you had people who had been initiated. And you would know by their marks, country marks. These is scarification that you'll see on their body. That would tell you the degree of transformation they had gone through. And so if, for example, you had an African who was enslaved in the US or the Western Hemisphere, who had undergone initiation and was in battle, they did not see themselves as slaves. They saw themselves as prisoners of war. And they conducted themselves that way. They were fierce and they were doing everything they could to rebel, but they had military skills well beyond those of the whites who enslaved them. So one of the reasons that you see the 170,000 Africans doing so well in the Civil War, they had this military tradition. Whether they were first, second, third, or fourth generation, that tradition had been passed on. And by the way, the skills that Africans learned in enslavement, a lot of that was passed on through secret society systems of training. And in the Caribbean, virtually all the skills learned are used at the end of enslavement to build an independent society. Both under colonialism, they're building up something, and then when they're independent, politically independent, but the skills are being learned from masters to initiates. So this is the nature of this system that's carried into the Western Hemisphere. In the Caribbean, what's carried is more direct because you're in societies that are 90, 95% African. In the US, more direct in societies in which we're overwhelming majority. But generally what we have to do in the US is disguise it more, but then these are secret societies. They're not hard to disguise because Africans are not divulging this. This is something slave masters did not know. They did not know that people are coming out of these secret societies. If they did, they would have had trouble handling it anyway, but they didn't know. So in the case of the US, the most prominent of the secret societies during slavery was the Loyal League. And the Loyal League was made up of people both in enslavement and so-called free men and women of color. Martin R. Delaney, one of our great scholars, a man who became a medical doctor, the highest ranking person in the Union Army, a major in the Union Army, one of the two sharpest minds we produced in the 19th century, Edward Wilmot Blyden being the other. Delaney was a member of the Loyal League. The Loyal League had views, and their views were basically about eliminating slavery. And during the Civil War, they served as spies, as well as they joined the Union Army and fight. But a lot of them were spies. And they knew, as Robert E. Lee knew, he knew that enslaved Africans knew everything that they were doing. And he knew that there were leaks all over the place. And so these secret societies provided major information for battle plans and everything else. And then, of course, made up great warriors. But during enslavement, people like Nat Turner were viewed as people who were making sacrifices for the cause of freedom. And the secret societies were the ones who were the most important perpetuators of freedom and of the spirit of resistance. So when we have the ending of slavery, then what ends up happening is Professor James Smalls and I, when we were talking a few weeks ago, he was giving as an example of the educational systems that we drew from at the end of slavery, was giving the example of the apprenticeship system. And what's happening at the end of slavery is the system that's being practiced in slavery is now out in the open, but it's still secret. There's a whole lot of stuff going on in there that is not being discussed in public. But the basic building of the infrastructure of the Black community came out of secret societies. And then out of that, you have the Black church. But the burial societies, because Africans believe that the life after death is more important than this life, therefore we invested in burial. It was very important for us. And if you go look at the old African burial customs of Africans during and after slavery, it's the same as Africa. They got the same symbols and everything on graveyards that you find in Africa. And so the earliest secret societies that are established at the end of slavery, one of the most important mechanisms for their organization was insurance for burial. And that becomes the basis for insurance companies. And so you have a large number of secret societies formed throughout the South, one of the largest in Arkansas with over 200,000 members spread throughout the United States. And these societies keep meticulous records. People put their money in and they're investing in a headstone, they're investing in a coffin, whatnot. And then later this becomes an insurance policy because at a certain time, whites wouldn't insure Blacks, which was a good opportunity for Blacks to set up insurance societies. Hundreds of millions of dollars worth. So these secret societies serve that. James Smalls was talking about how the Odd Fellows, the Masons and stuff like that served as a cover for secret societies. Richard Allen's creates the Masonic order, but it is the African Lodge in the beginning. And that is, again, secret society. Now, the key thing about these secret societies is this, and this is not only true of the secret societies, our culture in general carried in this African educational system. And the educational system was a system of mastery. Some of us don't like the term masters or master because we're associating it with slavery. You're not going to throw out the baby with the bathwater, because here we're not talking about slave masters. We're talking about people who had mastery of themselves, mastery of their character, and mastery of their gifts. And so when we talk about the masters in this system, that's what we're referring to. We're not referring to anything that has to do with enslavement in terms of slave masters. We're talking about the mastery of your gifts. And so when I interviewed John Henry Clarke, I'm really interviewing him for the purpose of knowing his masters, because John had 12 years of public school education. And what he said about that was, it was better than university education, not the 12 years, but the years after under masters, because, and this was his key point, and it's a real good point, he didn't have to unlearn anything, because when he underwent apprenticeship under masters, then those masters are the ones who are giving him the most advanced knowledge in his subject area, and he's a historian. And so Arthur Schomburg becomes his first master. And Arthur Schomburg has the greatest collection on African and African-American history in the world, and that becomes the Schomburg collection. So John is apprenticing under a master in African and African-American history. Arthur Schomburg was an Afro-Puerto Rican living in New York. And so that becomes his first master. So this African system carried out of Africa through these secret societies operate on degrees or levels of knowledge. And John wasn't conscious of what the degrees were, but he had terms for them that represented what they represented. And so he would call his initiating stage his formative period. And John had a very noble way of describing his life into stages and stuff, and very accurate, but formative. And so I would always use his language when I interviewed him, but they were levels. So this is the main point I'm going to make here. This is a major breakthrough that I've made. But this comes through being faithful to African-American culture, then you come to appreciate African culture better. And by deeply embedding yourself in African culture, you are able to get into its depths and then appreciate better the depths of African-American culture. So each is a window to the other. And so when I was writing the book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, I always have a habit when I'm writing a book, I'm always starting to work on something else, and I put my mind on something else. When I'm finished for the day writing, I'm doing something else. So in this particular case, I'm doing some work on jazz. And it's a great book called Thinking in Jazz. Big, thick book that's going into the levels of jazz mastery. And so I'm reading a passage by Walter Bishop. And see, this gave me the insight that enabled me to understand what I'd been going through, because I'd been going through the transformation, but I didn't understand the stages. And particularly, I didn't understand how it worked in African-American culture, though I was drawing from African-American culture. And so Walter Bishop, is a great jazz musician, he makes this comment. he describes 3 levels of mastery in the African American system. And these 3 levels, I knew instantly, was the same as the Dogon system. You see, I had this Dogon outfit on because if Binga had been on the show, we were going to compare his mastery under Sheikh Anta Diop to my experience of mastery under the masters that I underwent. And so I honored the Dogon. I'm wearing, this Dogon outfit that I have here, the great mass ceremony that's portrayed here. And so I'm reading Walter Bishop. And Walter Bishop describes 3 stages of mastery. It permeates the entire culture. Very few jazz masters know its root, let alone intellectual masters, let alone political masters, let alone scientific masters. But they've gone through it. They've done it. Malcolm wouldn't know this. He would know the certain components of the African American part. He hadn't really put it together of where he was at in this because we're not conscious of how our culture works because we take it for granted. You hear me? Huh? So Walter Bishop says there are 3 levels. He's describing jazz, but it applies to all areas of African American culture. 3 levels. And when he did these 3, it enabled me to understand what I had been going through in the Dogon system. I understood I had been going through transformation, but now I understood the stages. I understood where I was at within this. It's like with the 6-fold stages of mental freedom. You can be undergoing an awakening. Your eyes open up. You're in love with yourself. You're at the romantic stage, whatever. But you don't know exactly where you're located in that. But it's okay because you're undergoing an awakening. But it helps to know. So what does Walter Bishop say? He says, everything that's profound is simple. He says it goes from imitation. He used a word that will throw you off, but I'll give you the equivalent, to improvisation, to assimilation, to innovation. It goes from imitation. Now by assimilation, he meant improvisation. And by assimilation, he meant bringing together, in this case, different musical sounds, different musical skills into a whole that blend. That's why he called it assimilation. It had nothing to do with the cultural implication you assume it means, but it meant improvisation, what the youth call freestyling, and then innovation. And then he described what each of these were very briefly. Imitation's your first level. You're learning through copying somebody. That's imitation. But you're not just copying, you are being that somebody. This is the key point. That's why you either apprentice under a living or a dead master, direct or indirect, or a combination of both, because it's the same way a child learns by imitating their mother. It's unconscious. It's total. It's mind, body, and spirit. And by the way, when you get into this system, it's transcending you out of the Western system, which is only mind, only mind. You hear me? And that's why this system is weak. You hear me? Because it leaves the spirit out, it leaves the body out. Therefore, you end up in the forked tongue position of saying one thing and doing another. You know what I mean? That's a white boy system, but blacks end up doing the same thing if you don't get into this imitation. But there's another equivalent in the 6-fold stages for identity that does the same thing. You hear me? And you need the identity transformation for this one to work. Because if you don't have the identity transformation, the mastery, you may get mastery like a Colin Powell, and you may be a very good general, but for who? Doing what? You're seeing all this moaning about what's happening in Afghanistan, but there's no moaning over the murder of 200,000 Afghanistan people, or the loss of limb and life and sanity of many American soldiers. No discussion of that. It's all about, well, how these people that helped us going to get out. You understand? And so there's no real look at the total effect that this occupation has had on the people, mind, body, and spirit, total, you know, a war that should have never been. Just because bin Laden did something, I know some of you don't think he did. He did. I call it a crown jewel strategy. He hit vitals that America had to get them to react, to get them into Afghanistan. I'm a strategist. I knew it instantly. Where were Bush's strategists? I don't know if Bush could spell strategy. Of course, I knew he could, but he didn't know the first thing about strategy. You know, first thing you do is don't fall for that. You know, don't fall for that. You hear me? They fell for it. Got sucked into a place that the Pentagon didn't have a plan for because they didn't think any political leader would be stupid enough to send American troops there. No one wins in that theater. No one. You hear me? So, you know, you hear all of this, oh, what's terrible about what's happened in this war and everything. But the key point is that it should have never been this kind of war that happened in the first place. But the key point is, when it comes to this African mastery system, this is a total system. They carried out total mayhem in Afghanistan that brought a lot of harm, both to American troops, American treasury, but especially to a couple of 100,000 Afghan people who are no longer alive, you know, and there should be concern for that. But this African system is a total system, mind, body, and spirit. And in the case of the 3 levels that Walter Bishop describes, when you're accessing it, you're imitating a master, mind, body, and spirit. Mind, body, and spirit. And then when you get to a certain level, you move to the next level if you choose to, because there are some people in music, for example, who imitate, that's all they do. So if that's your choice, that's fine. You're preserving old schools. That's generally what whites do. We usually don't do that. But the key point is there's 3 levels in the African-American system: imitation, improvisation, innovation. I knew instantly. That's the Dogon system. Jiriso, Beniso, Boloso, and Sodaya. Take out your pen. Beniso, B-E-N-N-E. B-E-N-N-E. Beni, S-O, so. It means F-O-R-W-O-R-D, forward, not forward, forward. The word in front of you. That's what that means, Beniso. I spent years in this system. This is a transformational system. You don't just read stuff and get it. It's a reorienting system that reorients you to the cosmos, gets you in balance with nature. And so the first level is Jiriso, G-I-R-I-S-O, Jiriso, forward, G-I-R-I-S-O, forward. And then the second level is Beniso, B-E-N-N-E-S-O, which means sideward. What this means is, this is the basic knowledge in the system, and they say forward because it's fairly obvious. The later you get into this, the less obvious it is, because when you're young and you're learning a system like a language, a child can learn a language very quick. But if you're learning a language when you're a lot older, it's a lot harder, you know? So the thing is, while this is simple knowledge, it depends on when you're accessing it. It may not be so simple because you have learned wrong things. And so you're going to have to reorient yourself. Like John Henry Clark said, the mastery system that he went through, he didn't have to unlearn stuff. And we've already gone through some other stuff, so we have to unlearn stuff. And the test is always, is this in harmony with nature? Is this the way the cosmos works? And this is a system, the Dogon, because they're astrophysicists, It's a system of realignment, getting you realigned with the cosmos, with Mother Nature, with yourself, because you're a miniature universe. So Jiriso forward and Beniso sideward, Giriso forward, Benneso sideward. How does this compare to the African American system? That's why knowing the African American system was so key for me to understand the African system and how it worked. It was working on me, but I couldn't really explain it, how it was working, because Jiriso and Beniso are learned through imitation. Mind, body, and spirit. What you're doing is realigning yourself with cosmic truths so that you think them, feel them, and act on them. And your intuition is in common or in harmony with them. It's an imitation. It's something you have to put inside yourself. That's why African system takes so long to go through. You don't go through this in a reading. It's not, because if it's just repeating what the Dogons say, for example, at this level of knowledge, then all it is the Western system of regurgitation, memorization, and repeating. But that's not what this is. This is about being. It's being these truths. The mantra is to know the truth is to be the truth. And I've broken the Western system of teaching by basically returning our teaching system to one of being what we know, as opposed to knowing and being something else. And that's the Western system. So in this particular case, in the Dogon system, the first 2 degrees of knowledge are the fundamental foundational principles that you need to know to get in harmony with the cosmos. And you learn those through a mind, body, spirit imitation. And over time, you recondition your philosophy, your thought pattern, your communication, and your behavior pattern over time. I'm paraphrasing Malcolm on that. That's how he described his transformation. But essentially, it's transforming you to be a cosmic person to the degree that you are, because we're all cosmic. We're all made of stardust and everything else. But due to this miseducation and everything else we've gone through, we've been disoriented. And I should point out that even when you got African-centered information, if you've got their method, you're going to end up in the same place, because you're going to be regurgitating something, but you're not practicing it, you know? So the big breakthrough here is that I'm able to discover that the African-American master system and the Dogon one are the same. Now understand, they're coming out of different circumstances. The Dogon are astrophysicists. We have a few. We don't have an astrophysics-based culture, right? So, but we're using the same system to translate the fundamental principles of our culture and our being. So that's the first thing about how this system works. And by the way, enslaved Africans called themselves him be, meaning he be what he believes, or she be what she believes. You know what I mean? So that's an African thing, as opposed to just knowing and repeating. So that's the first thing. On the fundamental foundational level, you get the foundation the same way. Dogon African-American, imitation. One's called Jiriso, Beniso, the other one's called imitation. So the 2 levels in the Dogon system is equal to the 1 in the African-American system. Now here's the real big deal. When I'm reading this, Walter Bishop is describing how the second level works in the African American system. And he interchanges the term assimilation with improvisation. And we are basically improvisational and innovative people. By the way, this system is describing our ethos, our being, our essence. The Kemites are Ma'atan people. That was their ethos, the way they carried themselves. They had their own civilization. They constructed it on spirit. And the ethos of it was truth and justice, goodness. That was the basis for it. The ethos of this country is whoever has the power does whatever they want. And by the way, that's an Aryan ethos. And they put on the top of it a sugar coating of truth and justice and all of this. We know when they wrote the Constitution, we weren't included. We know that when they wrote the Constitution, it was designed to suppress their own people, Shays' Rebellion. It was to protect the wealth of the 1% that had half of everything. That's what this was for. So all that other stuff is icing on the cake. And that icing on the cake is fake. You know what I mean? So you need to understand the ethos is not white supremacy. I don't use the term. Racism, yeah, that's a basis. White supremacy, they ain't supreme anymore. You see, they're running out of Afghanistan. You know, they had to run out. They got whipped. Ain't no white supremacists get whipped. You know what I mean? They ain't won a war since really the Civil War, and we won that because the Russians won World War II. What wars they've won. With all this bad military equipment that's impoverishing you because your roads are run down, schools are run down, everything's run down. You got a roof over your head, all the rest of this stuff. We've gone through this before. So the ethos here is power, baby. Arbitrary. And if you find a Black person operating like this, they are truly operating out of madness because they're not operating out of their culture. You hear me? And there's very few that do that. First, you ain't got the power to exercise it anyway. But when you do, it's on such a petty, terrible level, taking something, erasing somebody. For what? You know what I mean? That's a few people, but we understand why. Forces that have hit us put us in a position of choosing between two cultures without being conscious of what we're choosing. So the ethos of Ma'at is in all African people, but we have a unique ethos based on the need for us to recreate our way in this reality, not out of nothing, but drawing from deep African stuff. And so that ethos is creativity at its highest level, the highest level of creativity that I'll go into in a minute, because that was a necessity for our existence. And I pointed this out before. In ancient Kemet, they have a term, Sep-Tepi, S-E-P-T-E-P-Y. It means first occasion. That refers to the watery noon. The first occasion for them is a watery stuff out of which life comes. That is their first occasion. And then God arises out of it and then ingests Ma'at. But it's a watery mass that is like their first occasion. So when they build a pyramid, they'd have water around it, you know, to remind you of the first occasion. Embedded in the African in America, who I call the new African, is this ethos of creativity, so much so that anytime we turn a corner and do anything new, we always do it the same way. We go inside our soul and we come up with something new. Or as the enslaved Africans, I've said this before, said, on the spur of the moment. Or as Dizzy Gillespie described it, through spontaneous organization. That's our way. King described it, you know, just as matter of fact. Oh, in Montgomery, we came up with a method that was very creative. It was just matter of fact. Sometimes we even take this for granted. And that's what the highest part of our art form is dedicated to, jazz. You understand? They would ask Coltrane, what did that song mean? It was not a good question because it's what it meant at the moment he created it. You know? And so that's what is key to us. And this spontaneous organization or creating on the spur of the moment is our expression of freedom. Our expression of freedom is through creativity. What is the essence of being godlike, creative? It's to be kind, just. That's the key. That's the first thing, ma'at. And then creative. That's the essence of why you're here. And that's one reason why the African enslavement could never be broken, because they knew they had this creative spirit. They were here for a purpose. And that's why their diviners were their leaders, not preachers. There were hardly any that were Christian, because they would divine, that is, they would do the reading on their gifts and tell them what their potential was. Like they wanted to escape, what's the chances of escaping? What's the best route? Blah, blah. But it was also about encouraging them to cultivate those creative gifts inside of you. And notice, we created the culture in enslavement. We created the art form in enslavement. So quit saying the white boy had all control over you. Right under his eyes, you created the most complex culture on the planet Earth, and one, if not one of the most beautiful. And at the same time, in your spare time, created art form that is magnificent, on which all the art stands. And because the drums were outlawed, music became the major thing. And the spiritual blues are the foundation. You should watch the piece I did on the spiritual blues. That's a foundation for hip hop. Hip hop is what? Urban blues. You know what I mean? It's an expression of beauty for this younger generation. We've all found the necessity to bring in beauty wherever we are because of the ugliness we're surrounded with. So when Walter Bishop describes this second level, which is best described as improvisation, he describes it as the process where, because he's a musician, he's using music, but this applies to all areas. What is the essence of improvisation? The essence of improvisation, let's take music, is bringing together, after you've mastered the foundations of music, is to bring together the different sounds and stuff. Let's say you're a saxophone player, bringing together the different sounds and licks and skills and everything else into a whole that flows. And what is improvisation? It is that an improviser is one who is coming up under somebody's school, who is at a higher level. And as they reach the level of what John Henry Clark called his mature period, that's what he meant by improvisation. And I had some discussions with him where he's very creative in describing how that worked, very jazz-like. So this is the period where you bring together these different sounds until you have a harmonious whole, and you add something of your own. So for John Henry Clark, when I'm interviewing him for the last time, he is describing his experience of developing in his mature period. And when I ask him, who was your master? This is the last interview I do with him. I've been doing 8 months of interviews, and this is about 5 or 6 hours of interviews. He says, he gives one person, William Leo Hansberry. That is his improvisational master. He calls it his mature period. He's very firm, he's very clear. Well, what did he do? He picked the greatest master on African history at his time in the world, William Leo Hansberry, who was doing the same work that Sheikh Anta Diop would do later, proving the Blackness of African civilization, especially focusing on Ethiopia, but on African civilization in general, and couldn't get a PhD, not out of Harvard or Oxford, because he challenged the major authorities on Kemet by proving that they were Black. And they all said, well, they weren't qualified to teach him. That wasn't why. That was because they didn't want to accept his teachings. And he had fundamental proof. The Greeks said that Kemet was black. For you white people, your best authorities are your own people. Herodotus said so. What do you got to say about that? You know? So what's improvisation? It is the creative thing where a person brings together a particular sound. In the case of John Henry Clarke, it's a historical sound within the school of William Leo Hansberry, but he's adding his own original sound. And that is what improvisation is. You're coming up out of somebody else's school, but you're adding something of your own. And John was a great, magnificent human being and historian and teacher. And he was much more a teacher than anything. He didn't write a lot, but he taught a lot and he read a lot. All those books in that library, he had read all of them, you know? So the point is, so what's a comparison between improvisation and the Dogon system? Well, the Dogon definition of their third level is the same as the African-American definition of the second level. Remember, our imitation takes in 2 levels in the Dogon system. And I have 2 masters at the imitation stage, Garvey and Malcolm. Those are my 2 masters at the imitation stage. One building on the other, you know? So what's the Dogon thing at this stage? The Dogon described this stage as Boloso, B-O-L-O-S-O, Boloso. How do they describe its operation? I've been going through this because I was at my Boloso stage beginning to go to another level when I was going through this at the point I read Walter Bishop. This was around 1983, somewhere, 1993, somewhere around there. So Boloso means synthesis, everything simple. Of course, this isn't simple. It means bringing together what you've learned at the imitation, the Jiriso and Beniso stages, along with the knowledge that you acquire at this level, blending them together into a synthesis or into a whole. And we would always stress adding originality. So improvisation and synthesis are the same thing, because basically what's happening in improvisation is you're bringing together many different influences. By the way, at the stage of mastery, you generally have a number of masters at the stage of improvisation, whereas at the stage of imitation, you have 1 or 2, you have a few. But in order for you to acquire originality, you need to draw from many different sources, but you're coming under an existing school. And for me, I was coming under the existing school of the Dogon and the blues. You hear me? And Amilcar Cabral and Diop and a number of others. I was bringing in a number of different things, you know what I mean? Blending them together. And so for each person, that's going to be based on your gifts, the masters you draw on, those that match you, your skills, So on 2 levels, the basic level that John Henry Clarke would call his formative level, the level of imitation, and Jiriso and Beniso are the same. And then at the level of improvisation that the Dogon call Boloso, the same. And so then what's the highest level? Now I'm going to do 3 systems here, but the Dogon are real key. And then the African American is fundamental here. So Walter Bishop says it goes from imitation to improvisation to innovation. Innovation. In the African American system, innovation is the creation of a new school of thought or new schools of thought. It depends, because some masters innovate one thing. Some masters innovate a number of things. And by the way, these stages are stages of human growth and development. This is not just Africans. Einstein was at the stage of innovation. Einstein's innovation was of one thing, the theory of relativity. Makes him a grand master because that's the master of sciences, quantum physics. And so he's got this major breakthrough, and it comes through thinking God's thoughts, a dream. He discovers something already there, but no one else had discovered it before. That's what discovery is. It's what God's already got out there, but you're the first one that sees it, you know? So innovation is the highest level in the African-American system. In the Bambara system, this is called Donikebas, D-O-N-I-K-E-B-A-S, D-O-N-I-K-E-B-E-S. Donikebas, what does this mean? Makers of knowledge. I think that's one of the best descriptions of this. Now, they are really discovering what's already there, but they are makers of knowledge for anyone in society, because nobody had ever seen this before. So this is new stuff. It's God's stuff. That's why the greatest breakthroughs are made when you pipe into God's mind. That's where you're going to really see stuff, you know? So an innovator is a Donikeba. John Coltrane was Donikeba. You hear me? He made 4 new schools of music, not one, but it doesn't matter. The number doesn't necessarily mean you're greater than somebody who comes up with 1 is less than someone who comes up with 4. It's a matter of complexity. It's a matter of, in this case, of music, of beauty, which is, of course, a personal value judgment in and of itself. But there is something for those who can continue to ascend and come up with new stuff. That's pretty profound. So, and that was Coltrane, and he came from average to extraordinary. The system made that. He had certain gifts. The main one was rhythm, and he had potential. I've gone through this when I talked about his astrological chart. But I studied him. I've got all kinds of folders on him. He's one of the 6 masters. I'm in him inside out. This was one magnificent human being too. Great character, great human being. In fact, his humanity, if anything, exceeded his creativity. And his humility was part of the reason that he could be so wide open, you know, to all these influences. He's always open, you know. So in the African-American system, it's innovation, creating a new school or new schools of whatever it is, history, of music, of science. George Washington Carver was at this stage, greatest scientist in the history of the world. Innovated so much you can't even count it. Model human being, magnificent. And some of us get tired of it because it's always about the peanut. It was a lot more than the peanut, but the peanut, as I pointed out before, George Washington Carver said, if you just lived on the peanut, you'd be nutritionally sufficient. It could take care of all your needs. So it's a lot more than protein contained in a peanut. But he did a lot more with the peanut than you think. Paint, he helped, you know, revive the dead soil of the South. He did all kinds of stuff, you know what I mean? Whatever he said, God inspired him to do. So in the African-American system, it's innovation. The Bambara, Donikeba, the maker of knowledge. The Dogon called this Sodaya, S-O-D-A-Y-I. So Daya. This is the highest level in the Dogon system. Now, there are levels within this highest level. These are people who are masters of the entire Dogon system in its ordered complexity. The highest would be those who master all systems, probably very few of those, and then others would master some part of it. And since the Dogon are astrophysicists, among many other things, then the foundation is going to be astrophysics. The African American, because of the necessity of being creative in this environment, we place the greatest emphasis on the creative aspect. In a traditional society like the Dogon, the creative isn't necessarily all that important. It is the mastery of the system at any level. And in fact, the Dogon would consider that if you come up with something new at a level of innovation, you're competing with God. So, but the necessity for our existence requires creativity. And that's our expression of freedom. But we're going through the same process. So this is an outward explanation of the system. You're just getting a little explanation here. You have to go through this in depth. Number one, when my book comes out, you get to see it because I have these, a lot of work that I've done on each master. John Henry Clark, Coltrane, Ella Baker, Theophilus Benga, Amilcar Cabral. I have to use myself because if I haven't gone through this, I cannot explain it. And so it's when you see the depth of this, you'll see how profound it is. Because this mastery system is a total mastery. It's not a mastery of a subject. It's a mastery of yourself in totality. We're a miniature universe within a larger universe. So this is what this system does, and you never get full mastery. You're always working on it. You've always got imperfections, you know? You've never got it all together. So the best you can do is, as one blues singer said, give it your best try. Give it your best try. And having the best masters helps. I'm in Kung Fu. I got me a great master. And then one of his students, who was a student of mine at San Francisco State, but his oldest student is now teaching me because he slows things down. I need somebody that can, these sets we go through, they got a lot of different sets to them. But when you pick a master, pick one that is really at the high level of their art form, whatever it is, whatever your gift is. Pick that one. Don't pick a chump. You hear me? And these young people now, you want to get out of the funk. You want to get out of all this stuff that making you feel like you're down and everything else. Your gift, baby. Draw on those gifts, bring them out, polish them. I'm old school, so if I go somewhere, my shoes are shine. Well, here we're talking about shining your gifts. Or as the old song said, this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. Polishing it, like Aretha did. She was a good soul. She went through some hell that she never conveyed in anything she relayed to biographers and stuff like that. And there's a reason why old school people don't tell everything. Some of it you just don't need to tell, you know what I mean? But in spite of all that, she radiated magnificent creativity. If Jennifer, I haven't seen the film, but if Jennifer Hudson doesn't get an Academy Award for this, there's only one reason. Who's given the awards? Because when Ray Charles was portrayed, that was a guaranteed Oscar because Jamie Foxx has, first of all, some artistic skills. He can play piano. I think that he was lip syncing. I think that was Ray Charles' voice there. But Sister Hudson, she's actually doing the singing. And it was at the request of the Queen of Soul, Aretha herself, who's coached her, told her things about herself, but knew she had the range of voice to do it. White people didn't pick this woman, she did. So she knew what she was talking about. The master knows those who have the potential to at least put a light on them, a good light. So me and my wife, we're going to go watch this tomorrow. I'm going to sit back and enjoy it because Aretha's one of my favorites. And of all her recordings, Amazing Grace is the greatest with James Cleveland, the brother who would play piano and sing in their living room. Her style is very much like his, you know. It's down home blues, down home gospel blues. You hear me? Pure beauty. And a sister who supported the Black freedom movement, put up money, was offering to bail out Angela Davis. She was just in the Caribbean, so they couldn't find her because there was no way to just instantly send money then. Father was asking, why are you doing that? And he had been a supporter of King's. He said, she's a communist. He didn't care what she was ideologically. She's for our freedom. Aretha, right on, lady. You hear me? She's an expression of this beauty. And you run around here talking about you ain't got no culture. You don't just have a culture, you got the highest system for replicating it on the planet. You're in danger of losing it to glitz and glamour, to dead presidents, to getting out of your mind. You ain't gonna lose it. To not listening to those who know more than you. And for elders, that could be a young person. And for a young person, definitely you need to be checking out your elders. And in this particular case, this magnificent jewel for the hip hop generation, those who have been most creative, they did apprenticeship and they can tell you who their masters were. You hear me? And all of them were not in their genre because they were creating, they were innovating a genre, you know, hip hop in all its different forms, you know, and the younger generation will innovate something else. And politically, historically, socially, philosophically, on all scientifically, we have the challenge of doing that now to save the planet. So that's kind of it. I decided to improvise today. And I'm sure we'll get a bingo on. And when he's on, he'll be on. I'm sorry he wasn't on today, but I figured I'm not going to leave you high and dry. So I hope you got something out of this. This is the crown jewel in your civilization. And you have a civilization here. Believe it or not. You hear me? So Hotep, I hope you got something out of this. And I'll deal with some other comments. And as soon as we get this thing straight with Obenga, we'll have him on. I see here Sun Temple. I believe that the Dogon system and transformations in some ways is like nature, a butterfly going through a metamorphosis. That's true. That's very true. You're reproducing that and at a magnificent level according to the effort each person wants to put in it. So it's your choice what you do with this, you know, given your best try, it's your choice. There's an essay here. Sun Temple and Black is Beautiful, Brother Ogarwa. And by the way, I'll be contacting with you with some of the suggestions you have on this show. Masterclass on the African Mystery and Mastery System. Yeah, brother's referring to some discussion that I've had on this on Philippe Matthews, but this is at a different level. Let's see what else we have here. Brother Ogawa, question: can the forked tongue concepts impact on Black America be compared to the dual consciousness concept? Dual concept is referring to, or dual consciousness is being referred to as being torn between two worlds. And it's basically describing what Du Bois called seeing yourself through the eyes of others, or assimilation, taking on the identity of whites in this particular case. So that's a state of mind, a state of consciousness induced by conquest. People have conquered you, and then what they try and do is get you to identify with them. And it's a common feature of the oppressed that they imitate their oppressor. And then if you're brought up under their educational system, while your families are teaching something else, then that's the basis for you being drawn into this seeing yourself through the eyes of others. But it's not the same thing as speaking with a forked tongue. Dual consciousness is a state of identity. Forked tongue is a state of dishonesty, a lack of morality, saying one thing and doing another thing. A person at the state of identity can still have good character. But this forked tongue, that's either bad character, or, to paraphrase our guest last week, no character. Everybody's got some. I'm joking. So that's different. Forked tongue is saying one thing and doing another. That is the Native American definition for whites. They speak with a forked tongue. My wife, Pamela Hurley, says, in secret societies, this is called neophytes. Yes, that's one term. Another term is an initiate. That's another term, you know. My wife also says secret societies are still prominent throughout the Caribbean to this day. That's correct. That's correct. They are still prominent here as well, but more prominent in the Caribbean because the Caribbean is more traditional African. Sun Temple, Oba T'Shaka, blessings to you, and I absolutely love the fabrics that you wear. Thank you. Okay, let's see. Letitia, Latoris, this message is so beautiful and reaching my soul. Thank you. That's why I do this. I hope that this is helpful for people. This is also part of what this show is based on. One is sixfold stages to mental freedom. It's getting people to go through the process. The other one is this mastery system. And when you're using these two, then you can be what you know to the fullest extent and rise to your highest level. Let's see. Frankie Elmore, are you all American Africans or African Americans? You're definitely not American Africans. And this should be some real proof of that deepest systems of mastery are really the basis for your culture. So that ain't American. unless you're talking about Native Americans. I'm sure they have their own mastery systems as well. One comment here, Stephen McKenzie, Frankie Elmore, we are Native Blacks in America. I would call us New Africans, that we had our culture attacked, the traditional culture. And so what we had to do is reformulate it based on fundamental African principles. And so that was itself the basis for this ethos of creativity, us having to recreate a culture. In the Caribbean, they could continue the culture. So it wasn't a question of creation or recreation. Us, we had to recreate it because of the systematic attack carried out on us due to the numbers that whites had. Even though we were a majority in some parts of the South, we're not a majority on this landmass. In the Caribbean, Africans were a majority. Sylvia Standback, thank you for all your teaching. Love your personality, clothes, and that fabulous ivory watch. I gave all of mine away when I left Nairobi years ago. Haven't heard Obingo since ASCAT days. We'll get him on, We'll get him on. Yeah, it's my favorite piece of art. This band was made by Makandi carvers in Tanzania. And it's a replica of African people in Africa, Maasai people. And Maasai means Ma, S-A-I-S, people from Sais, people from Egypt. That's another term for Egypt. So it took these brothers a week to make this watch band out of a knife. And they said they made this so that the African American brothers and sisters would appreciate their greatness. And it's I love beauty, mainly beautiful character. But I also art. This is my favorite piece of art. I wear it. And it's a testimony to their creativity. Okay, let me see. I'm going to go back down and see if there are any more comments here. Lisa Grayson, Ashe, we absolutely love you, Elder. Thank you for educating us and providing us with this knowledge. Okay, so that's it. This is an improvisational day. I usually prepare these, but I said, well, I ain't going to leave you high and dry. And we'll have Obinga on when he's on. It's going to be soon, too. I can guarantee you that. So I've enjoyed this. I hope you get something out of it. But understand, this is an outside explanation. There's the internal part of this is practice. This is what you live. So Hotep.